Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our second meeting of the Research Colloquium on Refugee Sponsorship. We're so delighted to have an opportunity to convene this conversation today. We were also delighted by how many of you were able to join us. So I'm going to suggest we jump right in. My name is Jennifer Bond, and I am delighted to be here today with a number of colleagues from the University of Ottawa Refugee Hub, as well as some of our important partners who we're working with on this research colloquium. I'm going to pass it over very quickly to my colleague Nathan, and we're going to be very short on the front end so we can jump right into the core of our conversation. Before doing that, I just want to thank and give recognition to Audrey Macklin at the University of Toronto, who has been a critical partner in co-organizing this particular workshop and is, of course, also a leading expert on today's topic. So thank you, Audrey, for helping us behind the scenes and pulling this all together, and also for sharing your expertise today as one of our presenters. I'd also like to acknowledge our other partners working with us throughout this series, as well as the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue at the University of Ottawa and SSHRC for supporting this initiative. And finally, before passing over to Nathan for a few other housekeeping matters and introductory remarks, I really want to thank my own team at the University of Ottawa Refugee Hub, a number of whom are here today. Nathan, Eliza, Jesse, Shizi, and Sunaya have simply been tremendous at pulling this all together and creating the opportunity for us to have this morning's exchange. So thanks so much to each of you. And Nathan, over to you. Enjoy the conversation, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and thanks to everyone for joining us this morning. We're delighted to have more than 200 people from a number of different countries registered for this morning's workshop. And we're very grateful to you for joining us. As Jennifer mentioned, the workshop is part of our research colloquium on refugee sponsorship. Our objectives for the colloquium are to share knowledge, to foster discussion and connection amongst researchers and practitioners working in a range of different disciplines and different countries, and to help shape a forward-looking research agenda on sponsorship. This is in fact our first workshop following the opening symposium that we held in March. And we wanted to start by looking at the role of sponsors, which of course is fundamental to the sponsorship process. We're delighted to be joined this morning by 4 presenters who have deep expertise on this topic, whom Patti, our moderator, will introduce in just a few moments. First, I wanted to say a thank you both to the Center for Refugee Studies at York University and also to the Institute for Research into Superdiversity at the University of Birmingham for partnering with us throughout the colloquium series. And finally, before I pass things over to Patti, since the University of Ottawa sits on unceded Algonquin land, it's our practice to begin our events by reading the university's Indigenous affirmation. So I'd like to do that now. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. And with that, I would like to pass things over to Patti Lenard, professor at the University of Ottawa in the Department of Philosophy, who is our moderator for today's session. Patti?
Brilliant. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Jennifer, for including me in this event as moderator. What an absolute pleasure to be here. First, I have the housekeeping job to go over how questions, etc., will work, and I just wanted to say that in the category of housekeeping, I am welcoming you from my children's room in my parents' house because my children are doing virtual school today. And if we're lucky, you won't see any of them during this event. In any case, here are the housekeeping things that I've been asked to go over before we get started, and then I will introduce our first speaker. You can't know this, but we are delighted to be joined by people from a range of countries across Europe and North America, especially. As you can already see, we're operating in webinar format, so you yourself will not be able to turn on your microphone or your video, but there are many ways that you can actively participate, and we hope that you will do that over the course of the 2 hours that we're together. We invite you to use the question and answer function throughout the workshop to highlight questions that you have that you would like to hear more discussion on. And then you can also, if you haven't seen this format before, you can also upvote questions that you think are especially interesting and that you would definitely like to make sure that one of the panelists speaks to. If you would like to direct your questions to a particular panelist, please indicate that in the question so we can direct it in the right way. Otherwise, I will take the liberty of assuming you're happy to have anybody or everybody answer your questions. The chat feature is also active. Feel free to introduce yourself and where you're joining from, or to share links to relevant resources if that seems appropriate, or to offer a question or comment related to the topic of the workshop. And please note that the workshop is itself public and it is being recorded. We will run this workshop as an interactive panel. So we'll hear from each of our speakers for about 15 minutes, and then we'll hold a Q&A session after all 4 of them have had an opportunity to speak. We will have a short break in between the speakers and the question and answer period in case people need any kind of break to go refill their coffee maybe. And then you will have the ways to engage that I've indicated. Again, the question and answer period and the upvote features, or the chat session, etc. And we will do our best to make sure that everybody's question or as many questions as possible get answered. And then with that said, by way of introduction, let me proceed to introduce our very first speaker. So it is my genuine pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who is Leonie Ansems de Vries. She's a senior lecturer in international relations and chair of the Migration Research Group at King's College in London. Her research interests include governance and resistance in global politics, migration and refugees, critical approaches to security and conflict, and the politics of life and security. She's involved in the King's College London private sponsorship initiative called Refugees Welcome University. In February 2020, King's was accredited as the first Refugees Welcome University by Citizens UK. Citizens UK is one of the leading civil society partners helping the government to design, produce, and implement the UK community sponsorship scheme. It describes itself as, quote, a people power alliance of diverse local communities working together for the common good, end quote. And it has supported pioneer groups to become sponsors in the UK since October 2017. And KCL will become the first university to act as a community sponsor for a Syrian refugee student and their family. Leonie, over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction and also for the invitation to speak today. So yes, I'm Leonie Ansems, and what I will do today is I'll speak a bit about research that I've recently conducted with Jenny Barrett, which is about the relationship building process between refugee families, sponsored families, and community sponsorship groups in the UK. Now I must say I've got a few infections, so if I get a coughing fit, I might need to stop a bit. But I've got my chamomile tea, so hopefully I'll be okay. Right, so my research in the past sort of 8-9 years or so is mainly been focusing on migration management, so really the violence of borders in a European context. And one of the things that we found really is that people are being illegalized or unable to access legal pathways to protection. So one of the things we've been advocating is legal pathways, more accessible legal pathways, and of course community sponsorship and sponsorship more generally is part of that. So my research in the past few years has shifted a bit by sort of, from looking at sort of all the violence and so on, the ways in which people are illegalized and marginalized, to looking more at kind of what can we do. And as already sort of introduced, I've done that both as a researcher as well as sort of being actively involved in the project at King's to sponsor a refugee family ourselves. But I won't speak about that here now. I want to focus on the research Jenny and I conducted, which was commissioned by Vries. So that's really about relationship building processes. So I'll first very briefly summarize the research, then I'll explain the approach, and then I'll just discuss a few of the findings. We've got a long report, so I'm just going to really look at a few of the points. I'm quite happy to discuss other points later on. So our research explores how community sponsorship groups and sponsored families experience relationship building. And we did that by conducting in-depth interviews, observations, as well as a survey. And we were really interested in seeing how these relationships might become supportive and constructive rather than becoming sort of paternalistic and codependent. And in very brief terms, what we found is that community sponsorship, so this is really in the UK context, whereby a community group or organisation supports and sponsors a refugee family. And usually that means support for about a year, including sort of accommodation, helping them with English language and housing support and so on. So we found that this is a very transformative process for the groups, the sponsoring groups, as well as for families and also the wider community. Very positively transforming process. And it's a community-based approach to overcoming divisions and borders within and across societies. So it really helps to create more welcoming societies through local action and kind of enabling sort of ordinary people to make a practical difference, which is, of course, fantastic, right? And very different kinds of relationship building processes and relationships exist among community sponsorship groups and sponsored families. So some are very close, kind of almost like family-like bonds. Others are more kind of professional or service style relationships. So there's a lot. So I'm really going to touch just on a few things because it's quite complex and varied overall. And these processes are really also kind of dynamic and intersubjective, so it really changes over time. And this is one of the key things we find, that these kind of processes of relationship building are processes of learning and development in positive ways, but it also means sometimes it might not quite go the right way, or people need to reflect on the ways in which initially they might have taken the wrong approach or it didn't quite work and so on. We were really interested in how that operated, right? So generally that's kind of positively transformational, but there are challenges, mistakes, frustrations, and so on as well. And we really focused on power relations in these processes because for us, we thought that power relations are kind of suffuse these relationship building processes. And that can be both kind of positive as well as sort of restrictive and negative, right? And I'll speak more about that in a moment. So quite often we see that community sponsorship groups are in a position of control in their relationship with the sponsored families, right? And that is partly a result of a kind of imbalance that is inherent in the framework, the way in which that community sponsorship framework is set up. But at the same time, we also kind of see this process of learning whereby, especially sort of groups learn to reflect and also step back a bit more and kind of understand, come to understand that it is a relationship of control and how that might be problematic. So we see that changing over time. So that is a very brief overview of what we've done. So let me say a little bit more about this idea of sort of power relations being everywhere, and then I'll look a little bit about at some of the findings. So the focus of our research was on discursive practices. So that is partly to do with the kind of language that is being used. How do we speak about a refugee family? Do we call them our family? Do we call them the family? Do we refer to them as refugees or something else? But also kind of broader practices that link to that and that kind of establish that relationship. And as we said, those practices and those relationships are full of power relations. Right, and here we understand power in the kind of Foucauldian sense as something that is relational, right? So it's not a capacity that I hold over someone else. It's something that's productive, much more than is repressive, although it can be repressive as well. Right, so there's an idea that power is at play in all social relationships. And it really sort of generates how people understand themselves, how they understand others, how ideas of belonging, exclusion take shape. Right, and that means it's also at play really at the micro level in everyday interactions, right? And that means we really need to sort of look at it and try and understand what is going on. So just to give a small example, for instance, I might be very keen to do community sponsorship, and I see myself as someone who really wants to make a positive change, right? By supporting someone in need, right? Which is great. And we see that a lot of actually people that are sponsoring have that kind of humanitarian motives, which are great. But at the same time, that kind of might unintentionally shape my understanding of the other as a passive victim who needs support, right? And that might mean I don't fully understand that they're also human beings, right, with their own abilities to shape their own lives, right? And social relationships very often include these kind of tendencies towards those hierarchies. Sometimes they're clearly visible, sometimes they're actually not, and it's quite difficult to really sort of see them and pick them. Right, so that is kind of that's how we went in. That was our understanding of how these things operate, and that's how we looked at this relationship building process. So what I'd like to speak about now is three points. One is really about these power relations and relationship building. Then I want to speak a little bit about the kind of language we use, and especially the language of boundaries. And then finally, I'll say a little bit about the broader environment and thinking more globally, but also thinking sort of historically. Right, so let's start with the first point. So, as I already said, community sponsorship is a way of welcoming people, right, by enabling community groups to support them, which is fantastic. But it also means that often these relationships, at least initially, are really shaped hierarchically towards one of supporters and recipients of that support, right? Even if the idea is really that we support the family towards independence over time, it often really starts out with sort of quite a clear hierarchical relationship. And we see that what we found is that most groups kind of start to become aware of this over time, of these power hierarchies, right? And again, we see that a learning process. So community sponsorship is really a learning process in social relationships as well, right? Much more generally, which is important. And one of the sort of give you a kind of sense of what we mean by that in terms of kind of who sets the parameters of that relationship. If you think about it, the way it works in the UK is that the sponsorship group needs to, first come together, set themselves up, have a whole organizational structure, apply to become a sponsor, get approved, right, and then prepare for the family's arrival. So they develop an organizational structure, establish a whole range of practices that kind of will already shape the future relationship in advance. The family, on the other hand, usually is sort of waiting to be resettled and often don't actually quite know what is going to happen. And what they prepare for mostly is kind of starting life in a new country, right? And that means that the moment they arrive into what is already kind of set up as, as a particular kind of framework. And in some cases, that framework is a lot more flexible than it is in other cases. So kind of that differs among different groups. But for instance, when the family arrives, often it's a very overwhelming time, as you can imagine, because the sponsorship group has kind of been gearing up to this moment to welcome the family, which is fantastic, but also to make sure that they're registered with the school, with the job centre, with the health centre and everything, right? So quite often they want to do all these things and also show them London, right? At the same time or wherever they are, show them around the UK, also do the social stuff. Whereas the family might actually, they're probably exhausted. They often are sort of traumatized as well, right? Sort of leaving their country and family behind and so on, right? So there is, again, you can see this kind of inequality going on here. And it is quite also because of the framework, the way it's set up, it's difficult to overcome, but I think there's some things that can be done. So yeah, community sponsorships tend to be in control, especially in the early stages, but also more complex relationships do tend to develop over time. And then often we see community sponsorship group beginning to understand the importance of the family shaping their own lives, taking their own decisions and so on. But quite often we find this really interesting. The community sponsorship group would see this as kind of ceding ground or giving up control, right? Which kind of suggests that they still have this underlying assumption that the ground is to be held by the group from the start, right? Rather than thinking of this as a kind of starting on an equal ground, starting this relationship equally from the start. And we see the same thing, especially with children. I won't say about that too much here. I know Audrey will speak about that as well. But also the home setup, right? They create the home, put furniture in there as well. And often the group is very keen to do that, which is fantastic. But it might mean that the family that arrives kind of doesn't really have a say of what their house will look like. Right. So one of the things that we recommend is really sort of thinking about the importance of establishing more equal relationships from the start, rather than just, through a kind of process of learning. And really seeing, that means also seeing families not just as people in need of support, but as like full human beings, right, with their own histories, interests, backgrounds, skills, and so on. And that might seem a really basic point, which it is, but often I think it's sometimes lost in the kind of eagerness to support people. So that's the first point. And the second point relates to the way we understand and speak about boundaries. So community sponsorship is about overcoming boundaries and borders, right, and creating a more welcoming society, which is very important, especially in the UK context, right, in which division, xenophobia, and marginalisation of others is also prevalent. And that, with that context, we were actually really surprised how pervasive the language of boundaries is in community sponsorship processes. And very often this stems from a concern with safeguarding. Now, appropriate safeguarding procedures are really important. But we would say we don't need the language of boundaries in these processes to think about safeguarding, right? So because the language of boundaries suggests that there is a kind of other who is potentially disruptive, right? Who requires bounding and managing. And again, that does something to the ways in which that relationship is then established. So again, we would say it would be better to create different types of narratives and more equal relationships from the start if we can. And we really found that groups were quite sort of preoccupied with setting boundaries in all sorts of ways, whether that was formal processes or social relationships, right? And quite often, again, that takes place even before the family's arrival. And that means that the family often is not very actively involved in it, but also often they were not even aware of the fact that these boundaries had been set. So again, they arrive into a pre-established framework that they're not actually really aware of. And again, that creates a kind of power hierarchies unintentionally. That makes it more difficult for the family to actively shape how that relationship then develops. But at the same time, again, over time, we see other things happening. Families do become more actively involved. But then often when that happened, it was on the one hand seen as something positive, which is great, but at the same time, some of the community sponsorship groups actually felt that they were it was something about blurring boundaries, or they sort of were caving in, right? So for instance, a group might have agreed that they would be quite restrictive when it came to accepting food or other things from the family, right? But actually for the family, they want to show their appreciation as well as kind of build relationship through the sharing of food. For them, that was really important, right? So you do see very different ideas of what kind of boundaries might be necessary or appropriate and so on. And it was interesting that the group sometimes is like, oh, we caved into that, rather than thinking, actually, this is how you establish a kind of mutual relationship. But as before, there's also kind of processes of reflection going on and so on. And especially groups that had sponsored families before, they're much more aware of these kind of things. But what we would recommend is sort of two things. On one hand, okay, yeah, sorry, realize I need to wrap up in 2 minutes, so I'll be quick. So create more flexible approaches on the one hand, and on the other hand, also really move away from the language of boundaries. There's different ways in which we can speak about these kind of working relationships, or the codes of conduct, or whatever you want to call it. And then finally, I'll be brief on that one. What we find is families were very appreciative and very happy and so on with, with being in the UK, but also they expressed feelings of instability and uncertainty regarding their lives in the UK. And I think that underlines the importance of, kind of making sure they become more independent, but also addressing wider kind of societal issues and perceptions of migrants and refugees. Right. So I think it's really important that we link community sponsorship to what else is happening with respect to asylum and so on, the illegalization of other people in the UK who come through forced think of this as a movement of solidarity, which I think we should, then I think there's two things we need to think about. Firstly, making that connection and resisting the much broader UK hostile environment in the UK. So making sure that all forced migrants and other marginalized people are welcome, included, and treated equally, right? And that means that really thinking about the fact we live in a world of interconnected mobilities. And my movement as a very white privileged migrant is interconnected to someone else being stopped from moving, right? And more generally, refugee resettlement is a less than perfect response to a problem that has been actively created through restrictive bordering and citizenship policies, right? Second point, final point, is that it also means taking a longer historical perspective, right? So we cannot understand contemporary forced migration without considering longer histories of imperial conquest, colonialism, and slavery, which are all histories of migration as well, right? So if the aim is to create more welcoming societies, it shouldn't stop at our local community or national border, but really include these kind of broader conversations about solidarity as part of refugee resettlement, which I think at the moment are quite disconnected, at least in the UK context. So yeah, that's the final point I wanted to make. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Leonie, for that. I'm excited that the questions are already coming into the question and answer space, so you can start to think about what your answers to those questions will be. And then I'll just take this moment to remind all the attendees that the question and answer function is already available. So feel free to throw your questions in there so we can compile them and get them ready for the discussion period. So thank you, Leonie. We will now turn to Audrey Macklin, who I'm also pleased to introduce. Professor Macklin is Professor and Rebecca Cook Chair in Human Rights Law at the University of Toronto. Her research and writing interests include transnational migration, citizenship, forced migration, feminist and cultural analysis, and human rights. Her research project, the one that she's going to talk about today, into private sponsorship, which is supported by the Trudeau Foundation here in Canada, centers around the specific inquiry: how does the process of helping refugees to become citizens transform the citizenship of the sponsors themselves? Audrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Patti, and thanks to Nathan, Eliza, and the others at Refugee Hub who've made this possible, and to all of the other speakers on the panel. I'm delighted to be sharing this webinar with you. I am going to do a presentation that I have prepared here, but I was struck by the resonances of many of the points that Leonie made, and I'm going to try to make connections and, in a sense, engage in a bit of a dialogue with her findings as I go along. So let me begin, if you want to just go to the next slide, by saying that here you see a bar chart of Canada's refugee resettlement practices since 1980, which is really the modern era for Canada's resettlement policy. The time period I'm focusing on is at the far right, from about 2016 onwards. And this, of course, was the surge in resettlement in response to what is known as the Syrian refugee crisis. Next slide, please. That witnessed a sharp increase in the number of people entering refugee resettlement for the first time, as distinct from those who had been engaging in the practice for decades. Many of those who had been the repeat sponsors, the long-term resettlers, as it were those who were connected often with faith-based organizations like churches, synagogues, temples, mosques, and so on. But we saw a lot of people do it for the first time in response to the Syrian refugee movement. Now, as Patti said in her introduction, our project focuses on the sponsors, who they are, why they do what they do, and what their experiences are. And that means that the kind of data that we've collected is not meant to be a measure of the accuracy of or the veracity of their experiences and observations in comparison to newcomers who are sponsored. We aren't also interviewing newcomers, and so there's no way of us to say whose version or whose account more accurately captures some kind of reality. We're focused entirely on the sponsors, but there is, of course, important critical research going on with respect to newcomers themselves. Our team of researchers includes many people who are social scientists. I'm a legal scholar, and frankly, I'm kind of new to empirical research, and it has been a complete pleasure to do this work. So this is the big question that we've asked. How does the project of making refugees into citizens remake the citizenship of sponsors? What we did is we conducted an online survey of about 550 sponsors, as well as followed up with over 85 interviews. And I'm hopeful that actually some of the people who participated in that are with us today. This is what's called a convenience sample. So it's not a random sample. So I can't say to you that the results, the data that we acquired in this way is representative of some kind of typical sponsor, because we don't know, people responded by choice to our project. Next slide, please. So who sponsors? Well, let me tell you, the average sponsor kind of looks like me. So what do I mean by that? Mostly urban, women, middle-aged, that's a flattering term for it, middle class, affluent, university educated, tends to vote on the center to leftish spectrum, white overwhelmingly, and predominantly self-describes as either Christian in origin or agnostic. And most have post-secondary education, that is bachelor's or upwards. So I fit into virtually all of those categories except the religious one. So I am in some sense the typical sponsor, and indeed, like Leonie, I also am involved in a sponsorship. Next slide, please. Now, very quickly, I just want to say that, like Leonie, the overwhelming response to our survey from sponsors was that their experience was positive. And if you can just click through to the various responses that people had. Again, I have to tell you that I have heard anecdotally of many people who had much more complicated and ambivalent experiences with sponsorship. I think that they might be underrepresented in our survey and in our interviews, simply because of the way people self-select to participate. But I can only speculate on that. Next slide, please. Now, the process of sponsorship is new to most people, and they generate what I consider to be two novel relationships that are outside the ordinary experience of most people who participate in them. And the first relationship is, of course, between sponsor and newcomer. And as Leonie mentioned, it is saturated with, as she says, hierarchy or power imbalance of people who are strangers to each other at every level. They bring to it perhaps some mutual expectations, but they are, in a sense, coming to this fresh and new. And part of what I'm interested in is the process by which people manage, for example, the power imbalance, which frankly most sponsors seem to recognize, at least in our interviews, and the ways in which they create relationship, the ways in which they strive to establish connections or relationships of trust and confidence. And I know Patti's research on this is also focused on trust, and the ways in which the novelty of their relationships cause them, in a way that I think is completely understandable, to reach for metaphors, to reach for understandings of their relationship that are analogous to those kinds of relationships with which they are more familiar in their lives. The other relationship is the sponsor-sponsor relationship. That is to say, the relationships that are generated within a sponsorship group. And some of the things that we have noticed in our research is that there is considerable variation in how these relationships form. A striking number of them are just, well, somebody asked me. Others are constituted around prior kinds of communities, let's say schools or churches or other kinds of pre-existing social networks. Some people bring a lot of prior experience, either as volunteers or even with sponsorship to this, but they all have to manage what Leonie described as kind of group governance and intra-group dynamics, again, in ways that are often new to them. And if I can just put it this way, if you imagine, say, a dozen people coming together to embark on what I'll call public work, this project of assisting people in integrating into a new country. When was the last time you sat around with a dozen people in your living room and tried to do something like that? Right? Most people don't have that kind of experience. They may work collaboratively or collegially in an employment situation, but this was a very new experience for many people, which brought its own challenges. I'm probably not going to have a lot of time to discuss that latter relationship in my presentation, just for reasons of time, but in the Q&A, I would be delighted to tell you a little bit more about what our research shows. And suffice to say that the experience of sponsors in their relationship to other sponsors can be both as gratifying and frankly as challenging as the relationships they have with newcomers. And that in itself, I think, is quite interesting and deserving of further exploration. Next slide, please. Okay. So I mentioned to you the ways in which people who engage in sponsorship try to find ways to understand what they are embarking on and what they are doing and how they are doing it by references to relationships that are more familiar to them. And one of the things that has emerged in our research, both through the survey and then through interviews, is a kind of reference to kinship. And not just any kind of kinship, but often what I'll call a kind of parental style relationship. And I'm going to pursue that for the rest of the presentation. But I want to foreground this by saying, I am not in any way making a normative claim that this is a good way to view relationships. I'm trying to give a descriptive account that explains perhaps why people reach for that metaphor and the ways in which they see sponsor newcomer relations as mirroring or embodying to some extent or resembling relationships that they describe as parental. Okay, I'm not endorsing this. I'm trying to describe it and explain why that may happen. Now, the first thing I want to do is say that I think this doesn't come out of nowhere. And one of the ways in which refugee sponsorship resonates with what I'll call this sort of parentalist kinship model is through the very structuring of refugee sponsorship in our legal regime. Now, on the left-hand side, what you can see here is what I'll call family class sponsorship and the family class undertaking. If I seek to sponsor a family member, a spouse, a child, a parent to Canada, I'm required to give an undertaking to the government. And essentially the undertaking is that I will support them financially, socially, and otherwise. And I will ensure that they do not draw on the public fisc through social assistance. And I will ensure, in a sense, that they become integrated into Canada in ways that enable them and our family to be self-sufficient. That's the family class sponsorship undertaking in our law. Now, on the right side, if you can bring that up, please. This is the undertaking people must make as members of a sponsorship group in order to sponsor refugees. And I hope what you can see from this is a kind of mirroring. There is a very similar model, a very similar undertaking that at its root is financial. The sponsorship group undertakes to financially support the family for a year and also to provide them, if you will, with basic needs and the means of becoming, ideally, self-sufficient and independent. Okay? So already you can see baked into the institutional structure of refugee sponsorship is an architecture that in many ways resembles the model of family class sponsorship in Canadian law. Next. So now I want to just give you some examples that came up in our interviews and our surveys about the ways in which people invoke what I'll call parental style metaphors. Okay, just bring up the first one. Thanks. And I'll give you a moment to read it. What I'd like to draw out of this quote is the way in which the sponsor talks about the importance of a kind of non-professional, informal relationship. And this idea, I think, again, draws on relationships, if you will, of intimacy and partiality, that we have a special bond that creates special obligations. We're going to do this for you because you mean something specific to us. And that's distinct from the kind of professional relationship that we expect of public servants who might be engaged in, for example, refugee resettlement and other services. They are expected, quite rightly, to be, in a sense, professionally neutral and impartial as between all of the people that they serve. But we don't expect that in our intimate or familial relationships. We expect people will be partial. We expect that they will be interested in their family. And here, drawing on the possessive metaphor that Leonie was using. Can I have the second quote, please? Here, what you see is this idea of trying to provide guidance to somebody and trying both to respect their wishes while saying, well, I know a little bit more than you do. Maybe I have more experience in life, and can I guide you in this? And this constant balance, okay? Another, you can see that this must be what it's like for parents. You worry about people, what they're going to do, because you want to, in a sense, protect and guide them, but you also know that they have to make their own choices. Third quote, please. Okay. And again, in this quote, a reference to people are going to make their own choices. I can't control what my kids are going to do. Why would I think I could control what adults do, right? And so here you see a recognition, they're not my children. And yet at the same time, a reference to a kind of parental metaphor. Next slide. Okay, so within this, I see two broad themes that resonate with what people understand to be a parental role. Again, this is a descriptive claim, not a normative claim. And the first is what I'll call the tension between guidance and autonomy. Sponsors struggle with how much advice to give, what to do when their advice isn't taken, right? How to wrestle with that. Again, many sponsors get that this is an issue, but they wrestle with it. Second one, right? And here you have, I think, perhaps as sponsors a little more self-aware about that, perhaps in the first sponsor I put up, that it's patronizing or it's paternalistic to be trying to tell people what to do. And the power dynamic that Leonie talked about shades into the expectation of gratitude, or that people are going to take your advice when in fact they may not want to. Just next click, please. All right, this came up a lot around two issues, smoking and buying a car. And I mentioned this, and I'm going to move on quickly because time's almost up, to say, you might think there are a lot of bigger issues, gender roles, religion, cultural difference, all of that. A lot of the time, it was about very quotidian things like buying a car and people smoking. Next slide. Okay, last example, the other big theme, support and independence. Again, this resonates with people's understanding of what they think they do as parents. Assist people in becoming self-sufficient on a pathway that starts with a position of greater dependence but moves to independence. And here, I don't have time, I'm just going to ask you to click through the quotes. The second quote here, pause on this for a moment. I want to draw attention to this one in particular, because this person was an interpreter, but also in a sense became part of the sponsorship group. She herself was a refugee. And you can see that her view is very much somebody who came and struggled herself. And she was much more forthright about this than other sponsors were, suffice to say. And just click through one more and then I'll stop. Okay, all right. The last point then I will stop on is the ways in which people as sponsors come to develop a more complex and nuanced understanding of the legitimate and fair expectations that one might impose on newcomers in terms of their trajectory into particularly economic self-sufficiency and so on. And this mutual learning, I think, speaks to a kind of evolution among sponsors as well, in ways that I think are significant and important. With that, I'll stop because I'm out of time, and I want to thank everybody, and I look forward to the discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you, Audrey, for sticking to time. I appreciate that as the moderator. Just before I introduce Inka, let me just say that their questions are coming into the question and answer place, and you can vote for them. So it's like kind of like a popularity contest for questions. So if you find that there's some questions there that you would definitely like to hear answered, please throw a little tick on them, and we will do our best to make sure that at least the most popular questions get a chance to be discussed in the question and answer period. Thank you very much, Audrey. It is always a pleasure to hear about your work. And now I would like to take the opportunity to introduce Inka Stock, who will speak to us next. Inka is a research fellow in the Faculty of Sociology at Bielefeld University. Her research interests include migration, gender and migration, sub-Saharan Africa, NGOs, development and migration. Dr. Stock has also worked as a consultant, researcher, and field worker in development and human rights programs for over 10 years, and she's undertaken field work in Morocco, Colombia, South Sudan, and Spain. Dr. Stock, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. So good afternoon or good morning for you, wherever you are. As I said, I'm a researcher from Germany, and I'm talking to you today about body schemes in Germany. It's a little bit different from sponsorship programs, but it's based on a small research project that I've undertaken in the city of Bielefeld between 2016 and 2017. And my main concern was similar to Audrey's and Leonie's research question, that I wanted to find out how the type of relationships that the migrant refugees and the volunteers, on the other hand, engage in influence the ways they think about migration policy making, and civil society's role in refugee protection. And I know that buddy schemes, or what are not exactly the same, or the ones that I have looked at, and not exactly the same as sponsorship, but there may be, I think there are a lot of parallels, and maybe it's interesting to look at sponsorship from this different perspective to see really what is similar and what is different when you change the institutional setup. So, yeah, next slide, please. Before I go on to tell you more about the relationship between the volunteers and the refugees, I have to tell you a little bit about this nature of the buddy scheme. So unlike refugee sponsorships, they are very informal, non-binding relationships, absolutely not institutionalized, ad hoc, and they involve a lot of different activities between these volunteers that accompany a refugee and the refugees. So it also means that there are no formal requirements regarding the citizen status of either buddy pair. The people I interviewed, they mostly were volunteers and mostly German citizens, but I know that there are lots of people also who have absolutely no citizenship status, refugees themselves. It doesn't matter how much money you earn or not, and your ethnic or religious orientation doesn't matter at all either. So same thing for the refugees. Many of the refugees, or almost all of them, of the ones that I interviewed in the buddy schemes, they had no formal citizenship status or even residency. Some of them were at unsecure status. The characters of the volunteers are similar to the ones, nevertheless, the characters of the volunteers are similar to the ones that Audrey was mentioning. But the people I interviewed were often female, between 50 and 80 years old, very highly skilled, well-educated, middle class, and many of them were married and had children. The children had already left the house. While the refugees or the migrants, asylum seekers they were accompanying were often male, between 20 and 30 years old, very often low-skilled, or had not had opportunity to have formal education, were mostly out of the job, poor and single. So they were very different pairs of people. And how did they come together? How did that happen? Why do these buddy schemes develop in Germany? For that, you just have to know that when from 2014 on towards 2016, due to the Syrian civil war and other conflicts in the region, over 1 million people came to Germany, and almost all of them in 2014, 2015. So many. And it was not coordinated, it's not a coordinated move. So in the summer of 2015, you had in many cities, people were, and local administrations were completely overwhelmed by the amount of people that suddenly arrived, and they had to organize temporary accommodation for many people. And that went on for quite a long time. And in this moment, civil society organizations and volunteers organized completely ad hoc to help. And in the beginning, it was really to help public administrations to organize the accommodation of refugees in the shelters. And over time, this developed. So when people started to move into independent accommodations or into the apartments, these volunteers who had been active in the shelters then saw that there were lots of needs that the local administrations could not cover still. For example, accompanying them to the doctor, organizing language classes, all these things, translating official papers. Nobody was there to do this. So in that moment, independent buddy schemes, like in a way sponsorships, sprang up all over the place. People who had been in the shelters just paired up with people they knew from the shelters and helped them in everything, in everyday life situation. This is how this came about. Some of these buddy schemes got then institutionalized by NGOs with the help of NGOs, but most of them, and the people I interviewed, had absolutely no institutional backup whatsoever. They were completely autonomous. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. So when I asked them, I wanted to know, find out why did these people engage in these sometimes very long relationship with refugees. And what I did, I interviewed a small sample of people only, volunteers, and then I interviewed later on the refugees they accompanied, independent of them. So I had the same pair interviewed both of them, and I asked them the same questions. So when I asked both of them always why they started to have this relationship, because many of them had already been together in their buddy scheme relationship for about 2 years when I interviewed them. I found it very surprising that almost all of them said something similar to what Audrey was saying. They were saying, we just clicked. We just have this special bond. We're friends. So one volunteer said this, and I read the quote. She was referring to 2 African migrants that she was accompanying. Said, I met them at the shelter where I was helping out, and they were talking French to each other. And I was so happy hearing them talk in French. You know, I love talking French. And I went over to talk to them. And they were so happy that someone talked French. And we immediately clicked, kind of. We liked each other. And this is a typical quote from the refugees as well, that they chose the person they wanted to buddy up with because they liked them so much. So it was a special bond. And I think that is a very important ingredient to the way the refugees and the buddies I interviewed made sense of their relationship. Next slide, please. So this does not mean that the people were not aware of the power imbalances that existed in their very unequal relationship, equally to Audrey and Leonie. The volunteers and the refugees, they knew very well that they were very different. So one of the volunteers, for example, said, this is not the same level. He is half my age, just a child, you know? In my mind, he's a young man. That means we do not have the same interests, not the same taste, not the same taste in music, you see? He's more like a godchild to me. So it was not, they were very clear about the fact it is not a friendship, it's a special bond, but it's not a friendship because it can't be because we're so different. So I was interested in finding out how did volunteers and refugees make sense of these differences and how did they overcome these power imbalances. Next slide, please. And I found particularly two strategies that both of them engaged in unconsciously and maybe also related to the gender roles they had and the people that were the characteristics there were. One of them was that there was a strong urge or need to engage in acts of reciprocity. And the people I interviewed did it by exchanging care, different forms of care. For example, refugees very often would do, for example, the refugee had tiled the floor in the volunteer's apartment, or another one had helped her move house. skills that also very male, traditional male tasks that they thought they were good at. They were doing that. Whereas the volunteers, they were very often engaged in transmitting German in a way, if you so want, values like teaching German or trying to show them the city and going with them on sightseeing tours. So that was a way how they were very, very keen of engaging in reciprocity, even though what they did exchange had different values. It did not allow them really to overcome this power imbalance so much. Because what the refugees normally did was something that could have been done by anyone, whereas the specific skills that the volunteers had were very specific. And the other one, the other strategy, and that is similar to what Audrey and also Leonie was saying, was kinning. In anthropology, this is called kinning when one tries to establish a kind of family bond with people who are not related to me via blood, and that creates belonging and inclusion. And it was very clear in the way that refugees were referring, for example, to the volunteers as their mothers or their sisters or their brothers, and volunteers themselves refer to the refugees as godchildren or even children. Again, same thing that Audrey was saying, this does not, while it does create belonging and inclusion, it does not necessarily challenge the unequal power relationship in this family relationship. Next slide, please. So, but I do think, despite these sometimes hierarchical relationships, or maybe because of it, and this is similar to what Leonie said, I think this friction and this awareness of these power relationship and these, trying to overcome this really was an opportunity for learning, and it did give volunteers and refugees opportunities for really becoming active citizens. And by that I mean really that there were opportunities for them not to blend into the society, but to actively shape it. In my mind, this should be the real objective of integration in diverse society. And there's evidence to suggest that while the volunteers, particularly the volunteers, were probably quite fixed in their views, both sides expressed that they had learned a lot about each other's cultures, their ways of being. The fact of engaging with someone so different than oneself practically does force people to rethink taken for granted assumptions in many areas of social life. Some of the volunteers, for example, told me that they knew almost nothing about migration policy or social benefit regulations before their dealings with the refugees, simply because they never had to deal with these issues before. And it was just when they had to accompany the refugees in their dealings with social workers and migration officers that they realized how complicated and often difficult the situation was for many of the people they worked with. And they had to learn how to confront officials as local administrations. I think some of the women had not done ever before, and they learned to be persistent and assertive in their fight for rights and services, even when being turned down in the first instance. And in these ways, they also helped change the practices of public institutions and social benefit offices, they said, because they had the feeling that often the social workers, they didn't even know how to deal with that situation themselves. And so, because this arrival of so many people at the same time had never happened before in this city. So also, both refugees and volunteers told me that the relationship had heightened their self-esteem and their ability to speak up for their own interests, and also in front of public authorities. And it heightened their critical sense of taking for granted issue. And I think that is, some of the volunteers said, for example, that they broke up contact with families and friends who they considered were hateful against foreigners. And it caused frictions with their families sometimes because they invited the refugees to family gatherings and Christmas parties, and then certain family members didn't want to come any longer and they just didn't care. So, and they were very happy about it, that they had the strength to do this. Next slide, please. So now to wrap up, I know that in 2019, the German government had started a sponsorship scheme similar to the one that exists in Canada. And I think it's modeled on the idea of the Canadian sponsorship program. So when I was preparing this talk, I was thinking, what would the volunteers that I interviewed say if I would ask them if they would become, would they become a sponsor after their experience? And then this is just speculative in my mind, hypothetical. And I was thinking, so maybe the first objection they would have is that they could not choose the person they would be sponsoring because it was so important for them. And the second thing, I think, and this is maybe a German thing, and maybe we can talk about this later, but I have the feeling that particularly for Germans, or for them and their generation, these people are interviewing, this feeling that the German state had the obligation to ensure refugees receive good settlement conditions. And the help of volunteers, by contrast, was to provide non-material support. Material support was to be paid by taxes. So I guess that this would be one of the reasons why there would be probably critical. And another reason I think is an important one, some or almost all of the ones that I interviewed would not be able to, or would be critical of the sponsorship scheme because they actively helped refugees that had no legal or very little legal possibilities to stay in Germany. And the sponsorship schemes would not allow them to support these kind of asylum seekers. And I think that might also be a difference. Thank you for your attention and sorry for going over time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Inka. I think it's going to be fun to have a conversation about how the formal sponsorship scheme maps onto or gives us similar kinds of lessons to the buddy scheme and what the differences are. I'm optimistic that somebody will pipe into the question and answer period and ask questions to compare the types of relationships that are formed. It is now my pleasure to introduce our fourth speaker. So let me introduce to you Bekele Woyecha. Bekele is the director of UK Welcomes Refugees, an organization set up to build community sponsorship and strengthen the community sponsorship movement in the United Kingdom. He was one of the founders of Sponsor Refugees Foundation, where he worked as a senior project manager until June 2020. He has been involved in the refugee welcome movement in the UK since 2015 and was one of the pioneers of the community sponsorship scheme in the United Kingdom. He was the Human Rights Defender Fellow at the University of Nottingham in 2009, where he studied international human rights law. And he has also studied at the Advanced Study of Nonviolent Conflict at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Boston in the United States. Bekele, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Patti, and thank you to Refugee Hub for organizing this wonderful, important session for us because, very often when we talk about sponsorship, refugee welcome, in general, we talk about the refugees. And the session we have in front of us today is the role of sponsors. Where do they come? When are we going to talk about the sponsors, the people who really make it from the kitchen table, whatever, that first discussion actually begins. So I'm going to share some of my experiences as I actually got engaged in myself into this. Next slide, please. So the first thing is what motivates people to become sponsors. First point. Connection to a country and culture, which is really important because, as I was traveling around the country, building welcome groups and then challenging folks, why are you in this? Why should you do sponsorship? And people told me, I have been to Syria, I know the Syrian culture, I speak Arabic, and so on and so forth. And there's that relationship, and I feel obliged to do something. I feel obliged to deliver something. It's a call for me, So that connection really matters. Is that motivated folks? Next point. addressing anger through action. You know, many of us would be angry about something. You know, we say there are 79 million people displaced around the world. About 26 million of them refugees, stranded in camps around the world. All those stories come to us every now and then. We hear all these stories, but what do we do? And some of us, okay, you know what? I am angry at this thing, but I should do something to address my anger. You know, it's not enough. It's always good to be angry, because anger, you know, helps us to act. So it's always good to be angry, but it's important we act. So for folks to actually deliver that anger, they actually they had to act. And as I was traveling around the country, I was asking, what do you want to do? You know, there's this crisis both around Syria, especially around 2015 and early 2016, but also in Europe. You know, the challenge we had in Calais, all those things were there. And I was asking people, why, what can you do? You are angry about this thing, you know, you are this is so appalling, but what do you do? So one of the things they wanted to do was, I want to get stuck and do it myself. So addressing anger through action, through delivering something. Next point, please. Joining partners, friends, and neighbors. This is equally important, you know, because sometimes what happens is, you know, I've got a number of stories on this. A husband or a wife, a partner might be interested in this thing, and then a partner joins. You know, one of the most interesting stories I heard was from somebody called Dr. Who in North London, and I just had him for a short chat, and I said, "Why did you go into this?" And they said, I have to follow my wife, because my wife wanted to do it, and all of a sudden I joined her, and I found myself actually painting a house, you know, as a sponsor myself. So he was motivated by that action of his wife, and these things very often happen. And as we build teams around the country, what we often ask it is, who else from your connection, from your friends, from your neighbors would be willing to do it? So all those things are motivational factors, and they motivate you. Next point, please. Yes, the desire to do good, because we really want to do good, and we have that thing, you know, can I do good? Because as humans, you know, we really want to feel good, and when you want to feel good, you can only feel good if you were to do it, and that's really important. Next point, please. And this is another important thing. First-hand experience, stories. You know, as we often say, stories inspire others to act. And when we hear stories of welcome, stories of those who have been forced to leave their homes, searching for homes, or stories of those who have done it, people are motivated to act. And sponsors, you know, very often, okay, once they have heard the stories, they will say, okay, this is something I could do. You know, as I was, especially, I remember my early travels around the United Kingdom in 2016, before we even had sponsorship in the United Kingdom. I have read a bit about Canada's sponsorship scheme. And then because of the challenge we had, you know, around the world, especially in camps around Syria, there were lots of people who really wanted to do something, you know, do it themselves, you know, because they were hungry and they wanted to do something. And then we're sharing stories. This is what happened. This is what's happening in Canada. This is how people are doing it, and so on and so forth. And people really want to do it. But at the same time, you know, hearing firsthand a story from a sponsored person or from sponsors motivates additional sponsors. And that's been really useful. Next page. How could this, you know, what sustains their involvement over time? This is the most important thing for me as, you know, as UK welcomes refugees, because we really want to see sponsors being in it for a while. Because for sponsorship to succeed, you know, to be as it is in Canada, which has been almost 40 years now, you know, we have to find ways to sustain it. First point, please. A relationship with the existing family. You know, once you have sponsored a family, you know, in the United Kingdom, we only sponsor a family. So once you have started to build that relationship, you know, you will say, okay, hold on a minute. Can I actually do it again? Can I, especially if it's possible, can I sponsor their family? You know, that's one of the areas we have to work on and get it sorted. But that relationship really matters, and people tend to learn a bit. Next point. Experience. Because once you have done sponsorship, once you've got all that wonderful experience, you know, starting from a kitchen table where you say, okay, what can I do about this thing? What do you think we can do about these things? All the way to building a team, getting that structure, that important structure you are going to have, you know, from being one person to a group, and having done a sponsorship, having sponsored a family, and having got that experience, you don't want to leave that experience. So you feel you should do something again, you should do it again, or you should help others to do it. That's what we very often see. You know, I've seen lots of groups, especially in London and in Wales, I could say, groups sharing their experience, groups wanting to do it, groups doing it probably more than 3 times, you know, about a few of them more than twice. So, you know, feeling more experiences, and I don't have to leave this experience. I have to use the experience at hand for the benefit of sponsorship. Next point. Resources, because as we know, once you have done sponsorship, there are resources available. And how can you use that resources for the benefit of actually doing more sponsorship, for sustaining sponsorship, or sustaining involvement of sponsors over time? So I've got resources. Can I use it once more? And can I use it once more again? And what I'm really keen is to see at least 5 sponsorship done by a group, if possible. Next point. Yeah, as humans, you know, we want to do more. The desire to do more, and that's one of the things we really want to see. We want to see, as you know, what do you call it, as many sponsorship done as possible. And this is what we often see. You know, those who have done it, they really want to do more, and the more they do, the more actually they deliver through their action. Next slide. And one of the areas I wanted to see, and this is widely actually discussed in all the presentation, I could say, because, you know, managing expectations is one of the most important things. You know, this is managing expectations of not only the sponsors, but also sponsor families. But we are talking about sponsors today. So managing expectation, you know, as sponsors, there are expectations. Sometimes it could be the first experience for us, you know, a group or somebody in that group might have never met even a refugee in their lives. And there is that expectation in them. And managing that expectation is one of the challenges in sponsorship. This is what they would want. This is what they should have. This is what they could love. This is what I could give them, and they would take it. And that's not always actually the case, because by the end of the day, others had that experience. But at the same time, manage expectation of what do you call it, sponsor friends. Because in sponsorship, as we have in the United Kingdom, it's a community sponsorship, and there are others in the groups, and, you know, manage expectation of that, because there's that what do you call it, managing power, because there's often conflict because around power. So that's another important area, to manage that expectation. This is what I can do, but this is what I can expect from my fellow sponsors. Not clear set boundaries. That's also important, because a sponsorship starts spontaneously. Because I've spoken to a number of sponsors in the United Kingdom, and very often I would ask, "How did you start? You know, where did the idea come from? Why did you do it?" And very often say, "You know, I started from this area. This was my initial intent, and there was no relationship with others, and so on and so forth." And then so it just that spontaneous action goes into formalizing. There's a need to formalize it, because by the end of the day, as we go from individual from one person to 2 and then to a group, you need to formalize it. And that's where you need that clear boundaries. This is what we can do. This is what you can do as a chair. This is what you can do as a treasurer. This is what a group, the charity that's going to be an umbrella for us can do for us. So there should be very clear boundaries. And when there is no clear set boundaries, then there's going to be a challenge for sponsors. Another important thing, which is very important, which we touched, in the discussion earlier as well, power over, not considering newcomers as partners. It's really important because by the end of the day, even if I'm sponsored by a group, it should be very clear that I have got my own expectation. So as sponsors, it's vital sponsors understand that there is what you call sponsor families should be considered as partners. They are part of this this partnership. So power over is one of the challenges we have, and we see very often. And and the experiences are actually different from place to place, because the more experience you have around sponsorship, the easier. But at the same time, if you don't have the experience, and those who have got experience should be in a position to shape it. But at the same time, should understand that everybody has got something to contribute. So I'll come back to the Q&A later. But as UK welcomes refugees, that's what we really want to see. How can we make sure the role of sponsors is there for a while? Because by the more sponsors and the more they are involved with, the more sponsor families there are going to be. So with this, I think I will just finish and say thank you to all.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bekele. So we have now heard from all four of our panelists. The plan is to take a 5-minute break. According to my clock, it is 11:18 in Toronto, Ontario. So wherever you are, we will return at 23 after the hour to start taking and answering your questions. Hi, everyone. I'd just like to invite everybody who's tuned out to tune back in, because we will now turn to the question period. I just want to thank everybody. Our international audience is doubtless amazed at how well we have kept to time. We were scheduled to start with questions at 11:25, and here we are starting with questions at 11:25. And I feel like you should feel amazed that 4 professionals with so much to say have kept to time, and that is because they've been counting on you to ask interesting questions to give them more space to speak. So my job is to moderate these questions, and your job is to ask questions, throw up ticks on or up votes, I guess that's what they're called, if you think that some questions are particularly interesting, and to do my best to get as many questions and voices in as we can. There's been a lot of questions, so I'm going to start with the questions that people have been asking with respect to power imbalances, because these are the sorts of questions that a lot of people have had an interest in. So panelists, the questions about power imbalances has been asked in a variety of ways. So let me sort of give you a shape of the kinds of questions that our audience have the shape of the questions that they've had. So Leonie, you've got some questions about the different ways in which refugee families in particular fight against the power relationship that is sort of endemic to the sponsor relationship, and in a moment I'll ask you to start there. But there's also questions about, more generally, questions about how refugees can limit the impacts of this power imbalance, in particular because refugees are not inclined to take legal actions if the sponsorship relationship degenerates. But in general, what are the ways that refugees can work within the power imbalance, combat the power imbalance if they think it's not working for them, etc. So I'm wondering if some of you might like to speak about that. I suppose that there's a few questions about asking whether or not the sponsors that you have spoken to, all of you, well, 3 of you have spoken to sponsors, and Inka to buddies. What is the way in which sponsors generally handle the power the power imbalance, but also the setting of boundaries? So there's some questions about how or what are best practices with respect to setting boundaries about what the sponsor job is, and how they can sort of simultaneously give guidance and maintain a strong relationship with refugees who may or may not take the guidance that is offered them. And then there's a related question, which I'm just going to throw into this first package of questions, which is from somebody who's planning a new sponsorship into the future, and is actually working with a sponsor, with a refugee or a newcomer who is highly competent in English and is actually quite keen to be involved in the planning process. Is that something that you think is a good thing or a bad thing, or how do you think about involving refugees or newcomers who have not yet arrived in the planning process for their arrival? So that's a big set of questions. Leonie, I'm going to ask you to speak very briefly to those questions, if that's possible, and then I will. The panelists are welcome to signal to me if they would like to answer it. But my plan, so everybody is on the same page, is to go to Audrey after Leonie. Sorry, Leonie. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Patti. Yeah, there's lots of questions, and it's really interesting to see that so many people are interested in the kind of power imbalances and power relations. And I think just a few things. I mean, partly this is more reflexivity needed on the part of community sponsorship groups. Partly this is about the framework, I think. And partly it's also thinking about what can refugees do themselves. But I think the first thing really is the kind of reflection on the recognition that social relations are always power relations. And I think that in itself is actually sort of quite important, although quite basic, because then we can start thinking about how do we interact, what does that do, and so on. But in the report, yeah, if you're interested, read the report, because actually we give like 8 different recommendations, which most of them are around power relations as well. One of them, for instance, is to say, well, actually, let's try and establish this relationship much earlier, which is pre-arrival, which is not really possible at the moment in the UK. And that could just be by video call. But if people sort of, let's say the community sponsorship group can already meet the family, realize the family has a whole life back there, right, in where they're leaving from, and can already interact, kind of understand who they are, you know, what their background is, what they like, what they don't like. I think that's just a fairly simple thing that might change things. And this is also something that we are recommending now in the UK context. And then really planning those first few weeks so that it doesn't become overwhelming, that you can create, you know, a more kind of equal relationship. Another part of that as well, and this I think also relates to what Audrey was saying, is like diversifying community sponsorship, right? Because in the UK, like, I mean, the profile that Audrey sketched is also very relevant to the UK. And for us, that also includes inviting previously sponsored families into community sponsorship groups. So that also sort of answers that last question. We think that's actually a really good idea. Again, you need to be really careful to think about, again, power relations and so on in that context, but diversifying community sponsorship more broadly, have a much broader range of people from, you know, from society, as well as there could be other refugees, could be resettled refugees, could be other asylum seekers and so on, in that process, that you could hopefully create much better understanding. Yeah, I'll leave that point there. There's lots more. In terms of, I just want to give some kind of positive examples of how families also kind of, you know, just actually do that thing, take decisions, and also kind of support sponsorship groups. We had some really interesting examples. For instance, one, someone from a sponsorship group was actually, well, because the kind of age was fairly similar with the sort of the mother of the family, and had similar age children. So actually, well, she was giving me advice on my teenage daughter, and it was really helpful because, you know, some of these issues are actually, you know, tend to be quite universal. But also, you know, someone who was a mechanic, one of the sponsored families, you know, would help out with the car and so on, right? So it's kind of the day-to-day interactions and helping out others that we would see in a friendship, for instance, or a family relationship. But I think also really, and it goes back to the kind of lack of diversity in community sponsorship, for a lot of people, it's also just really learning about what the situation of refugees is. Both sort of in terms of their forced movement and their backgrounds and so on, but also in the UK, and also generally people who are not middle class. Some people actually know very little about the circumstance of people who are on, you know, who are on benefits and so on, and so they learn a lot from that as well. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Audrey, would you like to come in on that?
Sure. I don't have a lot to add to the points that Leonie made. I will say that there is some evidence that pre-arrival contact can be very constructive in the ways that Leonie describes. Not always, because not everything follows a rule, but I think there is real merit in what she says. I'm going to pick up on another thread, though, and say something a little bit different about boundaries and so on. So here's what I would actually say about what I've picked up from reading interviews about boundaries that's a little bit different. And that is that it is not as, I do not read as much or hear as much about boundaries as something that sponsors feel they have to strictly impose or adhere to. What I instead have encountered more often is a situation where some sponsors bring expectations of intimacy and very meaningful personal relationships into the expectations of what they're going to get out of sponsorship. And when those expectations are not met, or conversely, when those expectations are overwhelmingly met, which is to say that the relationships become incredibly intense, then sponsors feel like they have to withdraw, redraw boundaries, and so on. And so that's often how I have encountered them coming up. The other point to make about that, which is an interesting one, is that is this expectation of intimacy or close personal relationships. Because there are also people who often are repeat sponsors, but not always, who say, look, I'm not doing this because I expect to make friends. That would be a bonus, that would be nice, but that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because of a political commitment or because I think it's the right thing to do. Maybe we'll get along great, but what do I know? These are newcomers, these are people from, I'm not friends with everybody I meet. I can't be sure about that. If a relationship develops, that's great. If I like them a lot and they like me a lot, that's great. If I don't, or they don't like us, that's okay. That doesn't mean that this is a failure. That's not what this is about. And so I think it's important to think about boundaries in relation to expectations about the nature of the relationship that sometimes people bring to what they're doing. And the last thing I guess I'll say about power relations is that I have also seen how what I described as that tension between guidance and autonomy and paternalism, if you will. I'm offering you advice, why aren't you taking it? That's sometimes the way people who don't perceive they have a lot of power in a relationship manage, right? They hear the advice and then they go and do their own thing, right? They don't want to say, I disagree with this, I'm not doing it. They don't want to appear ungrateful because this whole expectation of gratitude tends to get baked into this as well. But they may simply not do it. And sometimes sponsors are frustrated by this, what they see as a kind of passive resistance. But I think given the power relationship that everybody knows exists here, it might be important to think about why people do that. Their priorities might be different. What they want to do is different. And part of respect and rebalancing relationships consists in part of recognizing that and not kind of growing too frustrated with it. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Inka, would you like to comment on this question? You are welcome.
Yeah, just one short thing. I think the biggest difference in what I presented in the buddy schemes, or if you want to call them like that, and the sponsorship schemes is really that they're so, in a way, anarchical. I mean, there's no rules. And but I find it so interesting that even though there are no rules, the same kind of problems arise, from what we hear. And in terms of power relationship, because this is absolutely unavoidable. If you have, it's like Leonie said, it's just normal in every relationship. And if you mix people so different and so different lives, that's normal. But I found that there can be something good come out of it. But I have to admit that I think the fact that the buddies that I interviewed, for example, had absolutely no support, no institutional support, no rules, nothing, made it a lot more difficult. And I think that is also, not to underestimate. And for example, to give you an example, I know I've talked also to lots of voluntary organizations in the city who were saying that in the aftermath, a year or 2 years after, all these buddies came up, they were just overwhelmed by the askings for counseling and advice from volunteers all over the city who didn't know how to deal with their expectations, their disillusions, and also from refugees who were not happy with the relationships. And, you know, so I think that, and they were saying that we simply do not have the means or the resources or institutional setup to do these people justice. You know, we can't support them, and they would really need some kind of guidance and help sometimes. And that is definitely, you know, something that is missing. And maybe in the sponsorship schemes, that's a lot more easier to, you know, to organize in a way. I could imagine, you know.
Thanks, Inka. So that actually leads into the second subset of questions, which I wanted to, which the questioners have asked, which has to do with questions of burnout. So I'm interested, Inka, that you're talking about burnout in the context of the buddy system, but also it's a question that all four of you have raised. So Inka, would you like to say more? You could say, you can decline, you could say no. Would you like to say more about burnout, and then I will come to our other speakers to see if others have some contributions to make about how to manage burnout. And I just want to signal that one of the questions that somebody asked, which I think is a really interesting one and worth considering, is this question of how long the sponsorship is meant to go. Because of course, for repeat sponsors, many people think of the, you know, that you could either think of the sponsorship as 1 year or whatever is the government designated time frame. But then there's the question of, are you expected to, how should you feel about continuing the relationship beyond that, so that you have people who, if they agree to take on additional, you know, sponsorships on a yearly basis, will form a huge sort of cluster of people with whom they might continue the relationship over time. And so there's a question about how that relates to our assessment of possible questions around burnout. Inka, the floor is yours again.
Yeah, actually that was a big problem from what I heard in my, not from the volunteers themselves, but or the refugees themselves, but from welfare organizations, migrant organizations. They were addressing that. What they have done in Bielefeld is they had self-help groups. So some volunteers and refugees together, they organized self-help groups with over Facebook and other places, where they mutually supported each other in when there were questions they couldn't answer themselves, they didn't know what to do. Then and I think that is still existing. And it was quite, I found this quite amazing, how also people who would normally not very used to use the internet the whole time were doing this, you know, we're engaging with that. And there was a volunteer agency set up by the city council, who had a social worker who replied to council requests from volunteers who were doing work for migrants in the city without being connected to any organization. And I think that was also, and they were also organizing sometimes trainings for volunteers. So I think that was, there have been, you know, attempts to address it, but I think it is a big problem.
Thank you, Inka. Bekele, would you like to come in on this question of burnout?
Yes, Patti. You know, in the UK, we have what's called community sponsorship. And for that to happen, you know, why do we have community sponsorship? It's all about sharing the load. And it's really important we share the load. Very often, there will be an individual or two who will do most of the job. And there could be a burnout. So it's really important. For you to do something, you must love it. But at the same time, you must be in a position to do it. So there should be delegation. There should be actually sharing the load. Sharing the load is really important. It's vital that you have to step back when at the right time. Otherwise, there's going to be a burnout, and the group might be dependent on you, on that particular individual, and the group itself could fail. So it's vital to consider all those things. It's not only me who should be doing it, and there should be somebody who would say it should not be only you who should be doing it. Everybody, you know, there should be step in and step out. So there should be that clear, clear boundaries set. You know, this is what we can do. We have sponsorship, which is a community sponsorship, not a private sponsorship.
Thank you, Bekele, for that. Audrey, would you also like to come in on this question?
One of the most common features of refugee sponsorship in Canada that I have encountered is the shrinkage of groups. They start off with large numbers of people, lots of generosity, and very quickly they become, it devolves into a handful of people doing all the heavy lifting. What I have concluded provisionally from this is that although a lot of people might see money as a significant barrier to embarking on sponsorship, and just to bracket that, that is a significant source of power imbalance, right? You have to have money in order to embark on private sponsorship, and having the money then becomes a kind of lever, right? So bracket that, that's, I guess, kind of obvious. But the point I want to make is that, in fact, at least through the Syrian sponsorships, money is the least difficult part of the story. Money is relatively easy to come by, time is not. And in fact, people often entered into sponsorship with great enthusiasm only to realize that with children to care for, busy lives, careers, they didn't actually have the time to do the heavy lifting that was involved in being available in the middle of the day for a variety of tasks. The consequence of that is that I would say the biggest asset that any refugee sponsorship group has is time. And who has the most time? Tends to be people who are not in the full-time work. Who do those people tend to be? People who are retired, or frankly, women at varying stages of their life. So it's not, there are a lot of other factors that I think explain the overrepresentation of women in it, but time is huge, time. And so the biggest asset, in my view, to a refugee sponsorship group are retired people. But that means that the people who are available, who are flexible in their time, are at risk of burnout for that reason. But that's something that absolutely should be part of the training, of awareness, and of the planning that goes into any sponsorship.
Thank you, Audrey. Leonie, would you like to come in on this as well?
Thank you. Yeah, just to follow up what Audrey said, because that's very what we found as well in terms of often retired women, and this was actually quite an issue during the pandemic because a lot of them were shielding, and that actually made it really difficult as well to kind of keep up that relationship. But that's sort of on a side note. No, I think in the UK context, really sort of, yeah, just echo what Bekele said as well around kind of sharing responsibilities. And one of the things that, at least from what we've seen in our research, is that what hasn't been looked at enough is actually relationship building within the community sponsorship group, and really think about who takes what role, who's got time to do this and so on, because often it's so focused on the family, which of course is really important, but I think actually that internal relationship building process is also really important, so that you kind of set out roles and so on. And we saw that, I mean, this is not a kind of sort of hard statement, but we saw a tendency towards groups that were better organized that way, that actually worked better than those that weren't and hadn't thought about that so much. And just one on a side point, what I found really interesting is that I hadn't thought about the kind of burnout and exhaustion so much in this context. Whereas in my previous research, which was, you know, around sort of border violence, I had a lot, because there we see people that want to act in solidarity with migrants, often actually also themselves are being targeted by governments, right? So you see that burnout really, really clearly, because there, you know, there's the kind of criminalization of humanitarian assistance, which is different in its context. But I think it's really interesting to see that nonetheless the same kind of issues arise as well, in terms of burnout and exhaustion. So it's just something I hadn't really thought about, but so it's interesting to start thinking about that.
Thank you, Leonie. I'm gonna take a question from a different angle, and so this is a question about the sort of the thought about good versus bad migrants and refugees. So here's the question. One of our audience members is asking if you could speak more about how one resists the use of community sponsorship as a way of separating good migrants, quotation marks, from bad migrants, also in quotation marks, and also the further stigmatizing of asylum seekers in general, rather than what we all hope that it will do, which is to bring more positive attitudes towards migrants in general. So Bekele, I'm going to start with you for that question.
Thanks, Patti. Actually, yeah, this is very important. You know, a sponsorship should not be at the expense of any sort of migration. It should not be at the expense of asylum seeking or spontaneous arrival. And they shouldn't be called, you know, good migrant versus bad migrants. sponsorship gives only opportunity for civil society to do a bit, to deliver, what you call to deliver to the crisis that's in front of us. Otherwise, that should not be good versus bad. And in my experience traveling around the United Kingdom, I haven't heard anybody saying, I'm going to be in this group to sponsor a good migrant or a good refugee. Never. It's all about doing, what they wanted to do, address the crisis, through action. So it's really important. But at the same time, when even policies are formulated by the government, it's vital that that we challenge them, saying we have sponsorship, good civil society is going to step in, or private citizens are going to step in, but at the same time we need to have a fair, balanced asylum policy in the country. So there should not be what's called a good versus bad, because there's no good or there's no bad asylum seeker at all.
Thank you, Bekele. Inka, I'm coming to you in 1 minute. I just want to add, somebody, Jenny Fillmore, has added into the chat a follow-up question related to this, which maybe future speakers can also address, having to do with whether or not any of you have actually found that attitudes towards asylum seekers and convention refugees has changed as a result of the engagement in sponsorship. So just to put that on your agenda as well. Inka, the floor is yours.
Yeah. I can answer that question together with the other one, because in my case, you see, the refugees were already there. Nobody wanted them. They were there. 1 million of them, kind of, all of a sudden. So the situation was different. And I think that because of many historical reasons as well in Germany, people engaged with it, with that situation. But many of the people I interviewed, many of the volunteers, they had no idea what immigration status the people had they were accompanying. They really didn't know, and in the beginning, and they found out later, and many of them were quite surprised to realize that they might not be able to legalize their status, even though, for lots of reasons, even though they were from Syria. And so they found out during the process. Sometimes took them a year until they found out, and also that the ways of legalizing were very complicated, and that asylum seeking processes were very complicated. Simply, they didn't know. So it was not that before they were racist or had something against migrants or thought they were good and bad asylum seekers. They didn't know anything. For them, they were all, they were just there and they needed help. So I found both. I found we have asked them if what if the person you accompany is going to get deported? Will you do something to prevent it, or won't you? And actually, there are some people I have interviewed who were saying, yes, of course, if the person has no right to stay, then they have to leave. And I will then, one person I knew, for example, has then engaged, when this person was deported eventually, has then engaged in organizations that helped deported people back in his homeland. So, she continued doing this. So that existed as well. So I think in general, all the people, at least the people I interviewed with, because they had never before thought about migration, they have engaged with the subject. I don't know if they've changed their views, some of them probably, but they had a view afterwards, one way or the other. So that I'm sure of. And in terms of the good and bad asylum seekers, I think maybe it could be a way also to have kind of sponsorships for people who are already there. Why not? Maybe is a thing to think about, depending on the situation a country is in. Why not? So,
Excellent. Thank you very much, Inka. Leonie, the floor is now yours to answer this question.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, this is one of the things I was trying to say. I was like, we need to link, these two issues. We need to link the legalization of migration and asylum seeking and community sponsorship, because they are very closely linked. So the reason, so that people understand that there's a much broader context, and sort of in a European context, that's sort of kind of European border regime, which is the way in which it is set up is to make sure that some people can travel freely by making it really, really difficult for other people to move legally. Right, that's the way it's set up. So I can move because I've got an EU passport, and I can move because other people cannot move because they're seen as dangerous and so on, right? And because of that system, right, because of the visa system and so on, people become illegalized, and there is a need to resettle refugees, right? Because otherwise they cannot come. Right. So all these things that are in my privilege is linked to the illegalization of others, is also linked to the need for resettlement. So I think having that broader conversation is really important, so that people, that is part of the community sponsorship conversation, and people understand that all these things are very closely linked, and, you know, sort of linking that to broader histories and so on as well. So yeah, that would be my response.
Brilliant. Thank you, Leonie. And Audrey on this question.
I would start with, who do we mean when we talk about the good and bad migrant? And the way I understand it and the way I tend to treat it is, in public discourse, the good migrant is the one we pick, and the bad migrant is the one who spontaneously arrives on their own initiative. So what does sponsorship do within that? Well, what happens in Canada, you know, so I would ask sponsors, has this affected your view of asylum seekers? The experience of sponsorship. Some of them would say, no, it hasn't. I've always been more in favor of, you know, more open borders, or I now appreciate how much people struggle and suffer, and it shouldn't matter how you get here. Others would, however, utter exactly what the good, bad migrant binary would suggest, which is, well, you know, actually, I feel a little bit less sympathetic to people who arrive at the border irregularly or whatever as asylum seekers, because after all, these good migrants, namely the refugees we sponsored, waited patiently in line while those bad migrants seemed to cross the border. And I waited a long time, as it were, for these, you know, this refugee family to arrive. So it can reinscribe the good, bad migrant category, but not necessarily. And my hope was always that this would seek, you know, the experience of sponsorship would make people reconsider that, become more critical of it. I don't have a conclusion about that. I think what I would say is that I think it is not predictable, and I'm not even sure that it's measurable by any of the techniques that I have. In terms of the European impact, though, and here I would say there is, I think, a significant danger in Europe that has no particular tradition of resettlement, that the embrace, as it were, of refugee resettlement will come at the expense of asylum seekers. That is to say, it will be yet another excuse or a tool used to demonize and vilify asylum seekers. And we see this in a country like Australia that explicitly trades them off, right? The number of refugees admitted to Australia is X every year, and the government will subtract from X those who arrive as asylum seekers, and the remainder will be resettled. So they pit the good refugee, the resettled refugee, against the bad refugee, the asylum seeker. I think there's a real risk of that in Europe for the reasons that are most apparent to all of my European colleagues. And I think just the last point on Inka's, why not adopt a kind of resettlement model for those who arrive as asylum seekers? It's an interesting question, because at the limit, you pose exactly the question that comes up. What happens to those sponsors when the state decides that those are bad refugees or bad migrants? And I suspect that that could actually lead to a very productive politicization of many sponsors, but that's a whole other conversation. But I do think it poses a different kind of question about the relationship between the state and sponsors who are in resettlement or otherwise on the same side, so to speak. Stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, everybody. My job is now just to thank you all four of the panelists, Inka, Leonie, Bekele, and Audrey, for a great question and answering the questions. Let me apologize to the people who have asked questions that didn't get answered. You can blame solely me as moderator for having been forced into the position of prioritizing some questions over others, which is very difficult to do in a constrained time and space. But thank you all for engaging so much. I invite all the panelists to, I invite all the attendees to harass the engage with the panelists further by email, because I know for sure they would all be happy to continue talking about their work. And the last thing that I have to do is throw, such as it is, throw the floor back to Nathan, who will wrap up this fantastic event.
Thank you so much, Patti. And thank you to everyone who has joined us for this morning's workshop. I think it's been a wonderful start to our series of workshops as part of the Research Colloquium on Refugee Sponsorship. Obviously, I want to thank Patti Lenard, our brilliant moderator for this morning's discussion. I want to thank our presenters, Leonie, Audrey, Inka, and Bekele for your wonderful insights. I want to thank the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue for supporting our series. And I also wanted to, we're excited to announce that the next workshop in this series will be on the topic of sponsorship in rural and small communities. And that workshop will be happening on May the 19th at 10 a.m. Eastern, the same time as this workshop. We have 5 wonderful panelists who have agreed to share their insights with us on that important topic of sponsorship in rural and small communities. So watch for further information on that coming soon. You can follow us on Twitter at Refugee Hub for updates on the series. And thank you so much once again for joining us this morning. That concludes our webinar.